So I will be talking about one of the most controversial and neglected topics in effective altruism or in doing good, wild animal suffering. So for me, it started basically with the following line of reasoning. We have in effective altruism our first focus area, improving human well-being. The strategy is economic development, saving human lives. But then there's this small voice in my head saying like, okay, you can save lives, but those people will eat meat, and we know economic development will increase meat consumption. Um, so that's we have to counteract this kind of negative side effect if we save lives or increase development. So we go to our second focus area, avoiding suffering of livestock animals. Strategy is, of course, reducing consumption of animal products, promoting veganism and things like that. But now there's a second voice in my head saying like, okay, but the ecological footprint of meat is much higher than vegan protein sources. Plant-based protein requires less land. So if we would switch to a vegan diet, we will have more nature, unless we destroy all nature. But now, okay, is this good? Do we know if increasing the area, natural habitats, is this a good thing? Well, we do not really know, but there is already quite a lot of animal suffering in wild nature. So that raises the second question. It's possible that we might even increase suffering by increasing natural habitats. So what do we do then? The third focus area would be decreasing wild animal suffering. So that's the topic of this presentation. And then what is the strategy? Well, people always ask, yeah, what are you going to do about it? Well, a starting point is start with scientific research for safe and effective interventions to improve wild animal well-being. Start with scientific research. That's the intervention that we have to do now. We are not going to directly intervene in nature and separate the lions from the zebras or things like that. No, start with scientific research. Well, let's look at first the prioritization criteria. So how big is the problem, how tractable is the problem, and so on. If you look at how big the problem is, well, if you look at wild animal suffering, the intensity of suffering can be huge. So suffering from disease, starvation, parasites, predators, injuries, venomous bites. The next slide I will show will contain some cruel images, so if you're sensitive to that, don't look. There's these kind of things happening. Okay, it's gone. So it can be very serious. When I imagine having those kind of parasitic infections or so, I think I will be scared enough. And I guess the animals also don't like it. Next to intensity, we have the scope. How many animals are involved there? Here you can see the numbers. Let's say humans, that's about 10 billion. Then the terrestrial vertebrates, farm animals, that's an order of magnitude higher. But then if you look at the wild animals, the wild mammals, that's even 1 or 2 orders of magnitude higher. The birds, again, amphibians, and then the fish, it's even more orders of magnitude higher. For fish, it's pretty certain that they are likely to feel pain and things like that. Then we enter the arthropods and the copepods. It's uncertain if they can feel pain. Let's say you give it probability 10%. But if you look at the numbers, that's, I don't know how you pronounce it, 10 to the 19th, that's quadrillion or something. It's enough, okay? It's pretty much. Even if you think that's 10% probability that they can suffer, then the expectation is very high. So the importance, the scope of the problem is really huge. Yeah? There is only one area that is bigger, and that's the far future. But if you're concerned about the individuals who are affected now, if you have in population ethics this kind of person-affecting view, like we should help the people who already exist and have preferences to be helped. Well, in that sense, wild animal suffering is probably the biggest problem. Then we have tractability and neglectedness. With neglectedness, it's very simple. It's strongly neglected, more neglected than artificial intelligence safety research or things like that. It's probably the most neglected field in effective altruism and in doing good in general, I guess. It's even neglected within the community of animal rights activists, even people who are really concerned about animal welfare and animal rights. Even within these communities, this area is until now still pretty neglected. But then the basic question is, what about the tractability? Can we solve this problem? And here the idea is, again, we should start with scientific research. We have to investigate the tractability. Can we safely, effectively intervene? Or first question, can we, if we study this kind of research, can we find out if it's tractable or not? Yeah. Of course, if it's not tractable, then we can stop with doing something about it. But no one can tell now at this moment that it's definitely not tractable, and it will never be tractable. So we have the value of new information when we do research, finding out if it's tractable. There's a huge value of information. Yeah? If we have this research and we find new ways, yeah, that's very valuable. So what is this basic idea? Well, what we would promote is a kind of new academic discipline, a research discipline, welfare biology. You can compare it with conservation biology. That's also an academic discipline founded a few decades ago when biologists start to realize, like, okay, biology is a science, of course, objective science, but we have a conservation crisis, species extinction. Now can we use our biological knowledge to look for effective interventions to protect biodiversity? Yeah. The value is biodiversity, and then the academic discipline is conservation biology. Now, if you do it the other way around and say, like, our value is now well-being, animal well-being, for example, then we can start a new scientific discipline, welfare biology. Yu Guang is most known. 20 years ago, he wrote a famous article that started this idea of finding a new discipline, studying the most effective and safe methods to intervene in nature to improve wild animal well-being. That's the topic. And why this is important? Well, if you look at basically the biggest ecological problem, I would say, and the most important, one of the most crucial things that we should know about the world is this thing called R selection. Does anyone have heard about R selection? Who has heard about it? R selection. For whom is it new? Okay. So for me, this is one of the most important facts in the world, if you want to do good. This R selection, the R refers to one of the parameters in population growth of wild species. So there is this logistic equation, the population growth, and it's kind of an S-shaped curve. It starts low and then the population increases and then it levels off. The R, it's the rate of growth parameter or the rate of reproduction, yeah, how many offspring. And the faster, the higher this rate, the faster this initial slope will be, yeah. And then there's another parameter that you see in the equation, that's the capital K. It's from the German carrying capacity. That measures how big the optimal population level will be. Yeah? When you reach its maximum, how many individuals can survive the carrying capacity of the Earth, you know. And what happens in nature, in evolution, is, very roughly speaking, species they reproduce, but this kind of reproduction, they can choose between two kind of strategies. On the one hand, on the left, you have the R reproduction strategists. They get a lot of offspring, a lot of children, most of them dying at an early age. Only a few of them will survive, yeah. So that's one thing. The good thing is you have a lot of offspring, but it's also a big investment to have a lot of offspring, because most of the children die. And then on the far right, you have individuals. Humans are mostly known for this. We are K-selection species. For us, we have only a few offsprings, but most of our children survive until reproductive age. Yeah. And even for humans, we are pretty unique in the world, perhaps the only species. For every adult, on average, there's roughly one child. Yeah. And this child becomes an adult. Yeah. That's pretty unique. That's nice. That's very nice, actually. To have this kind of everyone can survive until old age. And yeah, you have everything in between. But the thing is, most animal species are tended towards this R selection. Yeah. And you can ask, for example, what would a life look like of an average animal in the world? Here you see on the horizontal axis when you die, the percentage of your maximum lifespan, and on the vertical axis, that's the number of survivors. So we are a K-selection species. We have a maximum lifespan, let's say 100 years, and most of us are dying close to this maximum lifespan. Yeah, so we are getting very old. Yeah. But then most of the other animals are R selection species, so they also have a maximum lifespan, but most of the animals do not even come close to this maximum lifespan. They die on a very early age. Yeah. And now you can think tonight in your bed when you can't sleep, you can try to look like, what would this life look like if you would have a long lifespan, but your life is very short, let's say 1 day, and you can live 10 years, but your life is 1 day. How many positive experience would you have, and how many negative experience would you have if you have a very long life expectancy, but you actually live 1 day? When you think about it, most people who are doing the exercise would come to the conclusion, probably it will be this short life of 1 day, it will be dominated mostly by negative experiences, hunger and parasites and predation and things like that. And that might mean that, well, at least there is a probability, I would say higher than 10% or so, probability that most lives on this planet are lives not worth living, in the sense that suppose you die and you reincarnate, and you have the choice between reincarnating as an animal sentient being or not reincarnating, like you reach nirvana. What would you choose? Probably you would prefer not being born again. For example, you can say, like, everything is nice in nature. When I walk in the park, I hear the birds whistling and so on. But for every bird that we see, you know that one bird lays more than 10 eggs during his or her life. And then what happens with, let's say, 10 eggs, 10 chickens, chicklets? How many of those baby birds are dying? Yeah? 9 out of 10 die as a baby. And only one of those birds will survive until adulthood. So we know for every bird that we hear whistling, what are the lives of the other birds that could not survive. They die, you don't see them because they are eaten, they are decomposed, eaten by worms, or so we don't see them. Yeah? We have a kind of, when we look at nature, a survivorship bias. We only see the survivors. The majority of animals we don't see. The majority of animals being born, we don't see them. So that's why we have a too optimistic appraisal of the situation of nature. Now, why is this a neglected topic? This is one of my, let's say, research areas. I'm an animal rights activist, and even when I raise this question amongst in the animal rights conferences, for example, I often hear arguments, fallacies, logical arguments, cognitive biases. That's really amazing that even animal rights activists neglect this problem. Even when they claim to be anti-speciesist animal rights activists, when it comes to wild animal suffering, they will become speciesist again, for example. Why is this so? Well, one of the problems that we face, the cognitive biases, is scope neglect. That's an example presented before. Suppose you on this site, you receive a letter that you can save 2,000 birds, an oil spill. How many dollars or euros are you willing to give? And you receive the same letter, only difference 1 0 extra, so you can save 20,000 birds, the same oil spill. If you would give $80, how much are you willing to give? I can imagine that you don't have 10 times as much, so perhaps not 800. But according to this experiment, about the same, or even in this case, a bit less, $78. That doesn't make any sense if you can save more lives. Another fallacy is, this idea that natural equilibrium maximizes well-being. Now, this is kind of related to status quo bias. Very interesting article written by Nick Bostrom and Toby Ord, two famous effective altruists. You can do this kind of thought experiment. Imagine that, let's look at the horizontal level, that's level of competition or the level of predation in nature. Let's take predation, okay? We know predation harms animals, the lion eats zebras, okay? And then I'm going to say, okay, let's decrease the number of lions. And then there's a lot of protest, no, the lions are harmed and so on, and it causes also suffering. Why not increase the level of predation? Why not reintroduce genetic modification, create new predator species and release them into the wild? So increase the level of predation by adding new predators in the world. If you believe that decreasing the level of predation would decrease well-being, then, okay, the reverse would be, this is called the reversal test. The reverse would be increasing the level of predation. And then you will say, no, that's also not a good idea. More predation means more animals being killed and hunted. That's also not good. So that also decreases overall well-being in the world. Then that would mean that the current level of predation, or the natural equilibrium level of predation, would be the level that maximizes overall well-being of all animals. Now, as we know, nature doesn't care about well-being. Nature has no preferences, no goal direction, and especially is not concerned about well-being. So the current level of predation is purely by accident. It would be a strong coincidence if this current level of predation would be the one that maximizes well-being. It's like if you have a topographical map of a mountain area and you randomly pick a point, chances are very low that you pick a mountaintop. Yeah? And the same with here, the same with level of competition. Competition causes suffering, so okay, let's decrease competition, and then the environmentalists say, no, that's not a good idea. Okay, let's do the reverse, let's increase competition. And they say, oh no, that's also not a good idea. Okay, but why is the current level of competition in nature the one that maximizes well-being? If you can't explain that, you have a bias, a status quo bias. Another fallacy is, of course, we cannot solve all this wild animal suffering, the problem is too big. Yeah? That's a very weird argument, because we as effective altruists, the bigger a problem, the better it is to work on. But here they say, no, it's too big, so we shouldn't do anything about it. Here we have another kind of cognitive bias. Suppose on your side here you have to choose, decide, well, we have the problem of factory farming. Let's say we can eliminate factory farming, and of course that reduces the problem of factory farming with 100%. You can completely eliminate this problem. And then you have another choice, decrease wild animal suffering. Let's say we have a specific intervention, let's say one vaccine or that you can give to all animals. A welfare intervention, but this only reduces wild animal suffering with 10%. Yeah. Now, most people would prefer working on problem A because that's a problem that you can completely eliminate. Yeah. Whereas working on problem B might seem more futile, like, yeah, it's only a few % decrease of this problem. But we as effective altruists, we have to compare the total reduction of suffering. And so we can look at this kind of curve. So on the horizontal axis, that's the actual amount of suffering of these two problems. And on the vertical axis, there is kind of the perceived badness of this suffering. And what this means is you have a kind of convex curve. Normally it should be a straight line. The more suffering, the worse it is. Double suffering, double bad. But here, eliminating problem A, so let's say problem A causes 1 unit of suffering, and you can eliminate it from 1 to 0. Yeah. And problem B, that's the wild animal suffering thing. It causes 100 units of suffering, and you can reduce it from 100 to 90. So this 10% reduction. For us, rationally, effective altruists, we would prefer working on problem B because that's 10 units of suffering less. But people, the perceived badness of suffering is different. And if you see on the vertical bars, it looks like working on problem A is more worth it. So this is called futility thinking, and it's related to this other cognitive biases, certainty effect, zero risk bias, and things like that. So that's also an important cognitive bias that we have. Another argument that I hear a lot given by animal rights activists is if we intervene in nature, that violates the autonomy of animals. Okay, and me personally, one autonomy, yeah, that's very crucial. Of course, if the animals themselves prefer not having this feeling of hunger, respecting their autonomy would mean avoiding their starvation. So I strongly value autonomy of animals. But what the animal rights activists cannot explain is where the autonomy is of this rat captured by a snake. Yeah? I mean, they care about the autonomy of pigs in cages, yeah, where you can't move. But in nature, well, this rat cannot move in any way, and then it will die. Okay, where's the autonomy of this animal? And it's not only one rat, but for one snake there are hundreds of rats losing their autonomy. But then they say, yeah, okay, but this predation, that's necessary for the predators, and therefore if it's necessary, it is allowed. Sometimes they say like snakes and lions, they have no moral reasoning capacity, so therefore they are allowed to hunt. I would say, well, that's not fair because, what if we have smart lions, or especially with dolphins, it might become very tricky. Probably dolphins have a kind of proto-morality. Probably we can learn to speak with dolphins, like if they are children, age of 6 years or so. Probably they could understand the notion of well-being, and they hunt fish. Okay, so imagine we have the smart dolphins. Are they allowed to hunt or not? That's very tricky. But anyway, still then, for dolphins, eating fish is necessary to survive. Now, one predator eats hundreds of prey animals. So that is permissible according to many animal rights activists. What is not permissible is a kind of reverse. The organ transplantation dilemma. Suppose you have 5 patients in the hospital and you can sacrifice 1 innocent person, and with 5 organs you can save the lives of, okay. What's happening is basically the same as, so for example, a lion, the mother lion, kills a prey animal and feeds the body tissue of the prey to her cubs. Yeah, and here the surgeon kills an innocent individual and use the body parts, feed the body parts into the bodies of the patients. Yeah, the 5 cubs, the 5 patients, and here it's basically in the reverse. 1 person can save 5 people. Yeah. But 1 lion is allowed to say to kill hundreds. That doesn't make any sense. That's really illogical. Another argument is an argument that I had before, and I consider this as my worst moral mistake. I did a PhD in moral philosophy about animal rights, and I kind of defended the predation problem. That lions are, that this was still allowed because this is kind of natural behavior. It contributes to biodiversity, and biodiversity is valuable, and intrinsic value of natural processes and things like that. So we speak about natural integrity, biodiversity, naturalness. I gave intrinsic value to nature, but now I realized that, okay, we have an ecosystem with lions and animals and so on. I can give intrinsic value to biodiversity of this ecosystem, so I value biodiversity. And on the other hand, I can also give intrinsic value, for example, to your well-being. I care about your well-being, yeah. Lucky for you, but well, for you as well. I care about your well-being. Now, the thing, of course, is that nature itself doesn't care at all about biodiversity, doesn't experience biodiversity loss, for example. Yeah? On the other hand, if I don't value your well-being, at least there is someone else, namely yourself, you value your own well-being. And as an altruist, I want to do what the others really want. Yeah? I want to do what nature wants, but okay, nature does not have brains and no consciousness, so doing what nature wants is kind of trivial. Doing what sentient beings want, who have preferences, feelings, well-being. You want well-being, okay, then improving well-being is good. This is kind of idea. 2 minutes left? Oh, okay. Okay, thanks. This burning museum dilemma. I prefer aesthetic value of paintings, and then there's a Mona Lisa burning, and there's a child in the museum who I'm going to save the child or save the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa itself doesn't care about being burned by the flames and doesn't care about aesthetic value and things like that. The child cares about not being burned by the flames, cares about well-being. So when I would save the Mona Lisa, I would say that my preference for aesthetic value dominates the preference of the child for well-being. The same with biodiversity. If I would say the lions are allowed to hunt and can do whatever they want for biodiversity reasons, then I would impose my own preference for biodiversity above the preferences of all wild animals. Yeah. Other fallacies: that we do not have a responsibility, no duty, because we do not cause this problem of wild animal suffering. Well, for animal rights activists, doesn't make any sense because they do not eat meat, but still they want to do something against factory farming, although vegans are not responsible for factory farming. Other fallacies: there is a difference between suffering caused by humans and non-humans. This is literally said by anti-speciesist animal rights activists. We have to make a difference between suffering caused by humans and suffering caused by non-humans. Now, if you have a moral rule that explicitly refers to humans, then, and they cannot justify this rule, why it's explicitly referring to humans, then it's itself a kind of speciesist rule. Yeah, it's very ironic that you hear they claim to be anti-species, but here they make the same mistakes again. Yeah, and then we have a whole list of fallacies. These are arguments given by animal rights activists, but I translated them like The lion are allowed to hunt the zebra, and I simply change the word zebra into child. And then see if anti-species would be indifferent between changing different, the species. So whether it's a human prey animal or a zebra prey animal, it doesn't make a difference. Yeah, and then the animal rights activists say, yeah, but zebras have to die of something. That's what they literally said. But if you translate like humans have to die of something, then they disagree again. So it's very amazing that, we are so vulnerable to all these kind of fallacies. Yeah, that's it.